This is the strategy inside everything. I'm Adam Pierno. All right, welcome back to another episode of the Strategy Inside Everything. Today I have the Chief Strategy Officer at Decoded Advertising, Val Nguyen, who has graciously scheduled time. We've already been talking for about 20 minutes and we had to remember to hit record, which is always my favorite part of the show, is getting off and running on conversation. Val, how are you?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for joining and making time.
Of course, happy to be here.
Would you do me a favor for the listeners? Would you give people a little bit of a rundown of who you are and what you've done in your career?
Sure, yeah. So as you said, I'm Val Nguyen. I've done strategy in the kind of creative agency sense. I spent time, like you said, at Anomaly, but also like at Mother New York. Great, fabulous agencies, really steeped in creativity. I've also practiced strategy a bit more upstream in an innovation space. I spent time at Google's Advanced Technology and Projects innovation arm, which, working instead of with creatives, working with engineers to say what is this brand? Why are we creating it? How do we actually embed that into the product development lifecycle? So again, like very different from, of course, briefing creatives. Engineers have a very different, mentality and mindset. And so that was like, building another kind of gear in terms of, how do you do strategy and also how do you communicate strategy? The strategy of strategy, if you will.
Which seems to keep getting more complicated over time.
Yeah, exactly. And then I have spent a bulk of my career at Wolf & Wilhelmina, which was a strategic consultancy. So operating still upstream, still doing some innovation work, but also really just focusing in on like setting foundationally, like what are the purposes and all the different brand architectures for a lot of different brands. Some of those being brands that were kind of babies. They had gotten their kind of legs under them, but they were really looking to take their business and brands to the next level. So for example, we worked very early days with Bonobos and helped, use brand to kind of get them up to that level. And of course, they eventually exited to Walmart, which was, phenomenal for them. But then also kind of going in and doing a bit of a blow up reset moment for very old iconic brands. Like, for example, Bacardi rum has been around for 150 years. They had a lot of, amazing heritage and legacy. And so to come in, take that all in, but then also look towards the future of like, where is this all going and how does like rum fit into that? So like, again, a lot of building from scratch or from like very nascent stages with startups to like, okay, you've got a lot of baggage here. Like, how do we sort through it and like reset? Like you don't, become a 150-year-old brand without like a lot of history, right? So, did a lot of that. And then, I've also, freelance consulted, was at Anomaly, as I mentioned. And so it was really exciting to me to come to Decoded because it felt like very different. Again, it felt like another completely foreign, in a good way, facet and corner of the strategic universe.
Yeah, for you to say it feels different, given what you just all the things you've already done, that's why I wanted to talk to you, because you have gone from consultancies that are hardcore brand. You've been on the ad side at great shops with deep strategic chops, but also as a consultant in Google. For you to say this one is different, it's like, well, what was left? How talk about how it's different from what you've done, or maybe it's different because it's different from what you were doing most recently before that, or is it different just overall? It's a different approach.
It is, I think, an overall different approach. And I think that what is really inherent to that and what I was excited to chat about today as we think about like approaches and like mental models and tools and whatnot is that I think as strategists, we're expected to have the answer. We are in the business of having the answer. And what is really interesting about Decoded and what felt just so different was this embrace of the unknown and actually using the unknown as a tool to push further versus a, maybe scary challenge to conquer, right? I think we have this mentality of like, here's a problem, we got to figure out the answer and like, let's move forward with that. But, I think as we've seen in this past very wild ride of a year that we've had, and I think we will continue to have just more chaos, more plot twists, more left turns, and I think
It
that,
doesn't seem like it's going to get easier.
yeah, I don't think we're getting off the roller coaster. I think we're like in it.
Yeah.
The safety bar is like come down, and we're like locked in. Like,
Just white knuckles now.
yeah, exactly. But with all of that change that we just have to embrace as the new normal going forward, it doesn't make sense to me to necessarily say there is one answer for this one problem. And I think the interesting thing about Decoded is, because we are fully integrated, we are able to ask really big questions, embrace the fact that we don't know everything, and actually experiment. And not just experiment, and I use the word experimentation very deliberately here, because I think there was a world where when I first, started having conversations with Dakota, where I was like, wait, you're talking about like testing, like you're just doing split testing, like, is it better for there to be a plant in the background or not? Which I actually think, working on another client, they did tell me that anytime there was a plant in the background, like these ads like outperformed.
Is that true?
Which was like very, actually not that surprising to me, but kind of good to hear that, based on the statistics, like that was actually true. So it's not that though. And I think that was a big misconception I had coming in. As soon as, the founder and I, Matt Rednor, were starting to chat, I was like, oh, okay, like this is just split testing. Like, frankly, not interested in that.
Right.
However, we talk about experimentation because the issue with split testing is, one, like you are playing with just like very executional variables, right? Like, is there a plant or not? Like, that's pretty executional. It's not very deep. You can frankly like sneeze and like come up with like maybe some variations.
Yeah. There's nothing to it.
Right. But rather, when, we talk about experimentation, we practice it at Decoded, it's going very, very deep in terms of, to go back to this idea of like strategy having the answer. Of course, we're always limiting the universe of possibilities through what we do, right? Strategy is as much what you don't do as what you do. So we're still limiting it, but we're opening ourselves up to this idea that there can be multiple things that are true at the same time. And if we think about maybe the classic strategy brief at a creative agency being like the square, where you're like, okay, creatives, team, like this is the square we're going to play in. One, still super hyper valuable. But I think what's interesting about Decoded is like we take that square and we actually kind of pull out the dimensionality and make it a cube. And we give creatives and everyone, CX design, whoever's working on the brand, we give them like multiple facets to play with.
Oh, that's
versus just having, this one corner to play with. You could say, let's actually strategically prototype some of these positionings, right? Like, instead of saying this is the positioning, like let's experiment. Let's like allow for some of that dimensionality to actually play out in the real world. We might experiment with different tonalities. Like, we're taking all these different dimensions.
Got it.
And we're putting those out into the real world to understand what people actually, want, respond to, et cetera. Because I think we've seen, take, not the most recent election, but the election before that, all the polls were wrong. Why were they wrong? Because when you ask somebody in an artificial environment, what are you going to do? And then you get into the privacy of the voting booth or the privacy of your own phone.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden, like, that gap between behavior and, self-reporting becomes really apparent. And so at Decoded, we actually experiment in the real world. We're not in focus group rooms, which like never yields anything that good with your like weird, maybe stale snacks. I think the one blessing of the pandemic is I think focus group facilities maybe are bygone era. I think even if you're doing a focus group, through Zoom, at least people are in somewhat of a natural environment. again, to go back to this kind of root, it's very almost like nerdy and scientific, but like it's not a real experiment unless it's in the actual environment in which
Yeah.
people are going to be making
The
decisions.
further you get from that environment, the more artificial the answer. I mean, we're terrible humans. We are terrible at predicting what we're going to do or how we're going to act given anything, especially when we're really far away from it. You can ask me if I'm standing in the grocery store, what I'm going to put in my cart. But if you ask me in that focus group room with the two-way mirror, I'm just going to tell you what I think you want me to say, I think.
Totally. Well, and I think if people can't even really tell you what they want, I think sometimes as marketers and strategists, we also walk around thinking that we can read the tea leaves and tell you what people at a mass scale want. And yeah, I mean, I think there's still room for gut intuition and really amazing upstream, like qualitative and quantitative research and expertise, knowing an audience. Like, I think all those things are still valid, but you have to kind of let in between all of that this embrace of the unknown. It's so interesting. We will, sometimes when we have initial meetings, like in our creds decks and that kind of thing, at the beginning, sometimes we'll play a bit of a game where we'll say, okay, we had this brief. We needed to, I'm just going to make something up. We needed to reach, millennial moms with a certain product, right? And we'll show actually three ads that we put into the real world, very, very different. Again, thinking back to that multidimensionality that I just talked about. One would be like really leaning into like being a mom and making time for what matters, and even from a creative standpoint, kind of executing in a way that like really tugs on those heartstrings.
Right.
Another way might be something that's really about like hardcore efficiency, and it's like you're a warrior getting things done, very, and also very different like tone and feel. And then like say a third one, and it's so interesting because we'll say, and this goes for clients as well as new hires, all the same. We're all in the same bucket. We all think we're experts in this, and we ask, what do you think performed the best?
And nobody knows.
Nobody knows. People always get it wrong. And I think it just goes to show, and I think in some regards, I think that can be terrifying, right? Like as a strategist,
but that shows the value of doing the test.
It shows the value of doing the test, but I think it also, like for me, and maybe this is just for those of us who've been doing this a little too long, but it's exciting that people can still surprise you. Like, I think that to me is that's where things are interesting, right? Like if it had just come down to, it's just kind of an algorithm in terms of like, this plus this plus this equals this result. Like that's boring.
Then we would just go
for that.
We just go turn the crank
machine and you just keep it going. And I actually get really excited by the fact that we don't know everything. And then, as we go into our experimentation, like we design so that we can figure things out. Because I think the other thing to go back to like split testing and a lot of other, even say focus group research, where it falls down is, sure, you might get a result, and let's pretend people know what they want, and let's pretend that people are 100% honest in focus group rooms. Like just
I'll go with
for sake of argument, let's roll with that, right? Well, the interesting thing is that even if you get the correct read, you don't know, if you didn't design for it, you actually can't, you're not learning anything new. You just know that ad A did better than ad B.
Right.
But unless you design ad A and ad B together with the strategic foresight to say, if I learn that A does better than B, how can I actually know why it did better? And that's where, again, like the way we kind of approach things in terms of not just strategically defining like what are some possibilities that we want to play with, but then strategically designing the whole experiment so that we can actually learn something off the back end. Like, again, that's where it's like, it just feels, it's very different.
Well, so you're not just doing a post analysis where you're trying to rationalize, oh, it did better for this reason because there's X in the background, or this, you actually designed for it. So you know what you were looking for, and you knew what kind of results were going to create differences of opinion or difference of action.
Yeah, it's like, it's going back to, the scientific method from, middle school and high school, where you learn about, independent and dependent variables. And of course, there's like, we can't completely isolate, because that's also the magic of creativity, right? Where it's like there is a little bit of that alchemy that happens when different elements come together, but you can design so that you can at least get, a signal that helps you understand like how and why things are doing better. And then of
Yeah.
course, like you keep exploring, the world changes, new inputs and insights come in that you need to then throw into the mix. So you're not like converging down to like a super ad. You're, maybe if anything, converging on a super idea, but like that idea needs to, the same with all the brand strategy that we all do, like have the flexibility to, move and groove with all the different, changes that a brand, might face in the
Yeah.
future.
Plus, that kind of testing that you're describing doesn't just say, unlike split testing, which is kind of like winner moves on, and the other thing that might be marginally different gets canceled out. This gives you permission to look at the dimensionality of the brand and say, okay, we tested 3, we tested 5. These 2 approaches were totally out. People do not want this positioning from this brand. These were okay, even though they finished, second and third, but they were a facet that people accepted about the brand a little bit more, or maybe there's a possibility for the next round that we could look at to see, okay, they didn't like humor, but they did like, intelligent economist type content.
Totally. And that's where, like, again, the scientific mindset comes in, where I think in the classic, testing mentality of advertising, it's about finding the winner and then cool, that's the answer, versus like to take a scientific, when scientists are developing things, a failure is as much of a learning as a success.
Yeah.
And frankly, you're going to have a lot more failures than you're going to have successes. I mean, just think about how we've all been thinking about science differently because of COVID, and like the incredible feat of just humanity in terms of getting to a vaccine the way that we did, even though it was built on like years of research and whatnot. But like that's when you're a scientist, like you're like, I don't know. These are big questions. These are big, we talk a lot about hypotheses at Decoded. Like, what are your hypotheses and
Right.
curiosities? Like, let's go chase them. Let's figure that out. And I think it's also like freeing for clients. Like, they have curiosities about, and like we can go and like learn, and like we can build those things into experiments and whatnot. And it's just, I think it just creates a bit more of a feeling of like we're voyagers on this expedition, and we're like figuring things out together, which is also really fun.
Do clients like it? Are they comfortable with it? Or are they sort of gritting their teeth and going with it to get to an answer down the road?
I think there are two types of clients in the world. I think there are people who are real. I mean, you could divide that across a lot of different things, but like, I think there are people who get what we do, and they're excited about what we bring to the table and our approach. And some of them are excited. They don't fully get it, right? Like they couldn't do the experimental design themselves, but like they appreciate the methodology, and frankly they also appreciate the results.
Yeah.
Because what we're able to do is like build your brand and business at the same time, versus I think sometimes leaders, CMOs, etc., they're put in this position where they feel like they have to choose.
Yes.
And because we are fully integrated, because we're thinking about like that big picture, all the learning, all the dimensionality, like we're actually able to deliver on that. So I think there are some people who are like, I get it, I see the value. They don't fully maybe like understand like all the like nitty gritty bits of the science and I mean, I'm still frankly 6 months in, I'm still learning a lot about, the media landscape, learning about, going back to brushing off my statistics from,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's like the general theme. I'm just going back to like high school, middle school, my like AP stats classes.
Cracking,
I think
cracking those textbooks back open.
yeah, exactly. Blowing the dust off them for sure. But so yeah, I think there are clients that get it and they're down, they're the believers. And then I think there's a lot of people that what we do is really scary, because one, it's very new, and two, to go back to that idea of uncertainty, some people embrace uncertainty and some people don't. Some people want to feel like, like I know our target audience like the back of my hand, and I can tell you exactly what they're going to do. And like that, like that like little quiz that I shared with you earlier, like that can kind of shake you in a good way or a bad way, right? Like that can either be like, oh, I'm having an existential crisis because I thought I knew all the
exactly.
answers,
This makes
or
me
it's
so
exciting,
uncomfortable.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. So just it kind of depends on, it goes back to like fight or flight a little bit, like
Yeah.
unknown, what do you do as a human?
Yeah. And there's a type of person
Yeah,
that wants to charge into it, and there's people that want to back away from it.
exactly. So I think, yeah, I don't think all of the marketing world is on board. I don't think all of the possible clients are on board, but the ones that get it, it's really fun because we can, hold hands and run far and fast together.
Yeah. And it's not what's so wonderful about what you're saying is it's not the only way. You've through your career, you've tried a lot of other ways that were also very successful. So this is another way. And if there's people that are very comfortable with it and they'll get the benefit of it,
Exactly. Yeah.
which
And
is
it's not
cool.
to say that the other ways are bad either, right? Like
Exactly.
there
Exactly.
are some instances where, the saying, right? Like if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I think as strategists, the more you can have, flamethrowers and
Yeah.
like
100%.
screwdriver, like all these different tools, like in your, strategic toolbox, then you can come to problems and say, okay, what's the right tool for this versus, well, it's all about brand purpose and that's the only answer for this. When it's
Like
like sometimes
if you
that's
wrote a
not what they
book on
need.
brand purpose, then brand purpose is the answer to every single problem, right? It's the same every
Right.
time.
Right.
For creative briefs, you mentioned about pulling them out and more into more dimension. Are you writing a creative brief for each position you want to test, or is it more one version of a brief that you split out different parts, like where this one's going to be about tonality, or this one's going to be about the single takeaway, this one's going to be about the competitive set that we want to focus on, and giving them playgrounds in giving the creative team playgrounds in each of those areas?
Yeah, it honestly, I mean, I feel like this is always the answer. It varies,
It
right?
depends. Yeah,
It depends.
that's okay.
I think that sometimes it makes sense to say divide up the briefs by audience, right? Where it's like, okay, we really want to not only allow teams to just kind of get deep and immerse with a specific type of audience, but I think, representation on the creative team. Like, I think there's a lot that goes into casting, to make sure that like the right creatives are thinking about the right problems. And so I think sometimes it does make sense to kind of divide up by, okay, like this team might take this audience, that team might take that audience, and like still sharing across, but like,
Oh, that's cool.
kind of creating that structure. But then sometimes, it depends. Like some of our experiments are very large scale and some of them aren't, right? Sometimes you are just, playing with like, maybe two different tonalities, and like that's okay as well, right? So sometimes the same creatives, right, are working across the different dimensions.
Sure.
And I think the other thing that is what I think is fun about the process is this isn't just about, I can't believe I'm going to put this on the record, but this isn't about the strategist just coming in and saying, okay, these are the things, right? Like the whole idea of this learning and experimentation and this feedback, this virtuous feedback loop that just keeps going and going, is also like creative really should inform what our briefs and our dimensions look like. And I know every strategist says this, right? Like as soon as you get the problem, you go and you like riff with the creatives, and like I think that's always kind of been a part of the strategic process when done the right way with the right amount of time.
Right.
But I think I've been calling them like these creative preheats, where we're just preheating the oven, where let's not even think right now really about dimensions. Like if we were to just wide universe start to crack this.
This is like before a brief. You just like, let's get in a
Yeah,
room and just
so
talk
I
about
call it
what's
a
possible.
preheat.
Yeah.
Exactly. But what's interesting with that is like, especially when you are designing experiments that have creative dimensions, like there's a reason why I'm a strategist and not a creative, right? There's certain thoughts that would never occur to me, as a strategist, that might be like, oh, it would be interesting as creatives to like try something out.
Yeah.
And so like kind of allowing space for them to actually not just like have a conversation with me, but actually start to play. Because I think it's hard sometimes to talk about something in theory. Like sometimes you have to just actually get the pieces on the table and start like mushing them together and like seeing what happens. And so like
100%.
creating space for the creatives to actually kind of create a little bit, then taking that in and saying, okay, wow, this was really interesting. Like I think another misconception I had was like, data and creativity don't go together. Experimentation and creativity don't go together. But actually, like, when we're just trying to put out a lot of stuff in the market, like,
Yes.
creatives can take those shots now. Things
And
that would have been killed by a well-meaning,
yeah,
client, but to go back to the idea that none of us really, really always know what's right
yeah.
or wrong, like, you're actually able to take a shot and actually make it. And sometimes those things perform so well and they would have been killed otherwise. So I think that's also like part of the fun, is that we actually open up the court a little bit in terms of, where do you want to take a shot from, creatives? Like, let's actually make that happen and give you a fair shot versus, so many amazing, brilliant ideas ending up on the cutting room floor,
Right. More
for
of
all
them,
sorts of reasons.
more ideas will make it through.
Right.
The agency creative process is a series of experiments anyway. I mean, the copywriter saying an idea out loud to an art director and a technologist, hey, what if we did this? That's an experiment. That's a test of the idea. If both of those people
Right. Yeah,
say,
that's true.
ah, that's a terrible idea, that idea dies. And or if they all love it and they bring it to the CD and to the next person and to the next person and to the next person, those are all mini tests. It's just not a great sample size.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, exactly.
So as a strategist, you have to be not flexible, yes, but also it sounds like you have to be a little vulnerable and willing to say, I've heard you say it a couple times, I'm not sure what the answer is. Like, let's talk it out and figure out and work together to get some directions that I can come back with and have some thinking on what I think is worth pursuing as the direction. And then let's work together to see which one comes together the most coherently, and we'll learn together in the market. Is that a challenge for you? Or is that kind of how you work anyway?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm being really honest, there is a bit of vulnerability because I think that, yeah, as strategists, we're supposed to be the smart one in the room that has the answers. I think on a personal level, like, I've never worked in a media agency before. Like, I've
Right.
worked with media agency partners, in kind of, your typical like IAT style structure, but
Yeah.
like, I've never worked truly hand in hand with media. And so I've had to go, learn a lot in terms of how does media really work in a way that, like, before you could, I had rough, I
Yeah.
knew enough to be dangerous,
You
right? To
knew
have a
enough to know your part
conversation.
of it. Yeah.
Right. But now, like, I'm having to learn kind of that next click in. And, like, by no means am I now like a media strategist or anything like that, but I'm
Right.
having to learn a deeper level of fluency. Whereas before, maybe I was just like visiting and I come in every now and then. Now it's like, no, like, I actually live here too now. So, like, I
Getting to
need
know
to
the neighbors.
know, yeah, I got to know the language and, other, how they think about, for example, strategy versus how a brand creative strategist thinks about strategy are very different. Again, another toolbox, but like coming in as a leader and being and saying, you know what, I don't know this,
Yeah.
has been really challenging at times because, not only as a strategist do I feel like I have to have the answer, but also stepping into a leadership position, you also feel like you're supposed to have the answer. And so for me, this kind of theme about embracing the unknown, being vulnerable to that, and, along, of course, with the backdrop of none of us know what the hell's happening this year with the pandemic and whatnot.
There's
Just like
also,
it just,
yeah, there's
yeah,
also
a
that.
pervasive, just, that's been a bit of my mantra, I feel like, over, the past 6 months, especially.
Well, I think that maybe the last question I wanted to ask is, you started this job during the pandemic. What is it like starting a job? I'm assuming you're working remotely like I am for most
Yeah.
of my days. What is that like? Because I picture agency. I just remember, the being around each other and the swimming in the same water, and that shared space does a lot for both the culture and the work. How has it been getting up to speed and learning all the things you just said remotely? More of a challenge, or you can't really tell because it is what it is?
I mean, it's been a huge challenge, a challenge that, I think I'm actually really grateful for because, as I think about leadership, again, of course, part of it is, the smart, let's lead from a strategic viewpoint perspective. But leadership to me is also so much about taking care of your people, making sure that they have the structures and the tools to thrive. And I think that I don't know if I would have had the same level of appreciation for the challenge of onboarding into a company. Like Dakota's been phenomenal. Everyone's been phenomenal. Like
Yeah.
there's nothing that I could say like, oh, if only this, like, I've had a shit experience otherwise. Like it's been working, but like it's been really tough. And I don't think I would have appreciated the challenges of onboarding unless I had actually gone through it myself. And so, Dakota's grown a lot we've added a lot of people. We're going to continue to add people. And I'm thankful because I think I can now, you think about that kind of, user journey, if you will, for team, like people on my team that I'm onboarding, because it's like not only are we asking you to like completely unlearn so much of
Yeah.
what maybe you held as like self-evident and unshakable truths as strategists, but like you're having to do it remotely. Like that's incredibly challenging. And so because I've gone through it, I think I'm like, okay, like maybe we need a little bit extra in terms of these types of tools, or we need a little bit extra in terms of like structures to help people just like get to know each other. It's sometimes just like basic human stuff, but like I joke, like, even now sometimes it feels like I'm, looking through a peephole that's like the size of in shape of a Zoom square, and I'm just like
Yes.
trying to look inside this organization and say like, okay, everyone, like who else is in here? Like
Yeah.
even the visibility, I think I mentioned a little earlier, kind of that the push that we've had as an industry and as a culture around equity and inclusion. Like you can't see potentially people that look like you, like unless your direct team. And I think we're doing a really good job of that, but again, like unless you see directly those people on your team, like you're not really seeing other people. It's not like
You're not riding the elevator or you're not walking the halls.
exactly.
You're only seeing the 9 people that are on the screen at that time.
Exactly. And so like just creating opportunities for people to see and get to know each other, even if it's as simple as like a little bit of like a um I've done kind of like a down the rabbit hole, almost like not an interview, but like a get to know you thing where I'll meet with somebody and I'll say, pick any other person here at Dakota that you think that I would maybe not cross paths with naturally,
Oh,
but
that's
you
cool.
think is just a great embodiment of this place. And then I go and chat with them, the next week. And then I ask them the same. In this wide world of like Decoded, who else do I need to know that I might not have run across naturally? And like, it's a fun way to get to know people and take kind of paths that maybe don't follow the traditional, like, this department or this team. Like there's certain kind of cuts in terms of how we think about organizations, and it just kind of surpasses that. And sometimes I'll be put in contact with somebody because like, oh, actually, like you mentioned dim sum, like so and so like loves soup dumplings and has all the great spots. So it's like sometimes it's just like a
Yeah.
more circuitous path that I think is
It
a
takes
bit
it
more fun.
yeah, it doubles the effort, but it's worth it.
Yeah, yeah,
You
exactly.
mentioned, I lied about that being the last question, because you mentioned something that you mentioned the people you're onboarding, and then you said asking them to challenge their own beliefs or unlearn things they had learned. Is that because I think you have to do that almost everywhere. Yes, I'm sure more so with the approach you're talking about, but how do you interview for that skill, the ability for people to leave things behind or to be open-minded about new approaches, and then B, when they're there, how do you make them feel comfortable with that vulnerability of, if you are trained to be the smartest person in the room, that's a hard thing for your ego to, or my ego, to let go of that seat at the table of, well, I'm the person who says this, versus now saying, no, I'm the person who gets to ask questions and write down the answers and riff on each of those answers.
Yeah. So I think in terms of interviewing, there's no silver bullet, I
Yeah.
wish, question, right? That like really allows you to ascertain that. But I think by asking a bit more, not inappropriate, of course, but more personal questions, less about like the work itself, but like how people felt while facing challenges, or,
Yep.
like I always like to start with, everyone wants to start off, of course, with like the tap dance of who they are. And like,
Yeah.
we're all so used to that. But really trying to break that a little bit and starting with like, well, where do you want to go? Because I think to have the kind of mental flexibility and eagerness to really tackle something different, I think that yes, it comes through in like what you've done in the past, but I'm really interested in like what are the big questions that I think we've all had those things. We're like, wait, like, okay, everyone's nodding along and this is supposedly true, but like, I have questions about this.
Yeah.
And really like trying to ascertain like what are the questions people have or what are the things that like for me, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is like brand identity and what's the balance of consistency and building a core of like who a brand is in the world while
Yep.
also embracing the fact that identity has become so multifaceted. Things that were binary are now on a spectrum. Why are we building brands in such a model? And that was just like a question that I had kind of like bubble. And it's like those type, like if you kind of just like put all the, career stuff aside and you're like, well, what have you been really curious about? Or what do you think is just wrong? Like asking people about their unpopular opinions.
That's hard for in an interview, especially. That's hard for
And
people to get to talk about.
yeah, it's oftentimes you're just trying to get through like, okay, like what are the things you've done? Da 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 da. And it's like, no, like what are the questions you have left to answer? Like
Yeah,
that's what I'm interested in. So I
yeah,
think,
that's smart.
having questions around that is great. And then in terms of onboarding, I think there's a lot. I mean, they've done lots of studies. I think there was a very kind of broad study done at Google. I think it was called Project Aristotle. Don't quote me on that, but they looked into, what are the things necessary, what are the elements and characteristics that are necessary for like innovation. And one of the big findings was just this idea of psychological safety.
Yes.
And so I think that is, again, if we're asking people to unlearn things, we're asking people to experiment and take risks and put things not just in front of clients that might be risky, but not risky, like more in the sense of like kind of intellect, like, is that the right answer? Or risky?
Challenging, risky.
Yeah, like, but actually like let's put that into the real world, like that can be very
I'm telling you,
scary.
it's almost always scarier to even share the idea with the internal team that you really respect if it seems like an out there idea, even more so than putting it out in the world to an audience that but strangers for the most part. Sharing the idea with that intimate group of people that are all counting on each other, if it's a really unpopular idea or a kooky idea, is sometimes that could be really scary for some people.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, like I would so much rather go on stage in front of a bunch of people I don't know than
100%.
to
Yeah.
do anything for,
Yeah.
somebody that like knows me and will, follow up with me.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll go
Instead
pitch.
of
I'll go pitch something, but presenting the same deck to the internal team later as like this is what we showed them is always much scarier because those people will call you out on your
yeah,
stuff.
exactly. So that sense of psychological safety and just like creating different avenues, for example, I think I would say all of America, but I think especially the industry that we're in prizes extroversion.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And it's all about who can take up the space in the room and have that loud voice. And like,
Totally.
a lot of, if half the world is extroverts and half the world are introverts, we're losing out on a lot of really interesting ideas because maybe introverts don't feel that safety to express ideas that in the way that's most comfortable to them. So like we've been working on, how do we create avenues for expression for people that maybe again aren't the loudest in the room because otherwise those voices always get drowned out or always at the end, so it's like some people are great on their feet, again extroverts, like we
Yeah.
can riff, we
Yeah.
can whatever in a
And
room,
this
it's
speaks to your thing
fine.
about focus groups too. It's those extroverts, those loud
Exactly.
voices dominate the direction of the conversation.
Versus creating space, like some people need to like marinate on things and they might not have the thing in the room, but give them, an hour after the meeting and they're going to come back with something incredible. Like, why would
Yes.
I miss out on that? And so, working to, build in cultural structures that allow for people to contribute in a lot of different ways. Like that's just an example of like how do we make sure that people feel the safety that is necessary? It's like kind of counterintuitive. Like you have to feel safe in order to do the scary things,
Yeah.
but that's
But
just
it's
how it
true.
works.
Well, it's like jumping out of a plane. You want to know for sure that the chute's going to open.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Val, this has been great. I'm glad we were able to make this happen. Thank you so much for making
Yeah,
time.
of course. Thanks for chatting. It was fun.
Yeah. I learned a lot. I wrote down a bunch of notes that I'm going to have to go follow up today now. So thank you. And I hate you for giving me more things to think about.
Anytime.
Where can people find you online?
Yeah, so I can be found I am a consistent brander, if nothing else. My handles across all things, Valerie Wins, VALERIEWINS, because I love a pun, on my last name. So that's kind of my consistent handle across different, all the different mediums.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. It was great to talk to you and great to get a peek into your Zoom peephole there and talk to you after so long. So thank you.
Of course. Thank you.
All right. Strategy Inside Everything is produced by me, Adam Kierno. If you liked what you heard, please leave a review wherever you listen to your podcast. It really helps. If someone shared this with you and you're just not sure where you can find it, you can go to specific.substack.com and sign up there to get episodes before everybody else. For more information about me, Adam Kierno, you can go to adamkierno.com. There's information about my books, my speaking, and my strategy work. Have an idea for a guest? Send it my way. Just go to adamkierno.com and you'll find a form there that'll help you connect. Thanks for listening.